I'm sorry, we're fully booked tonight." The words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret Williams stood at the front desk of the Grand Palmetto Hotel, exhausted from 16 hours of travel, rain dripping from her coat. She watched the young white desk clerk's eyes sweep over her dark skin with barely concealed disdain. "Your website shows availability," she said quietly, pulling out her phone. "The system isn't updated," he replied dismissively, already turning away. "Try the Comfort Inn down the highway." Then the doors opened behind her. A young white couple walked in, laughing, shaking off the rain. "Excuse me, do you have any rooms available?" the man asked cheerfully. Margaret's breath caught as she watched the desk clerk's face transform into a warm smile. "Of course, sir. Let me see what we have for you. We have several options available." In that moment, Margaret Williams made a decision. She wouldn't walk away. Not this time. Not ever again. Because what the desk clerk didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the woman he had just humiliated owned every inch of the building he stood in. And in the next few minutes, everything was about to change. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the streets of downtown Charleston into rivers of reflected neon light. Margaret Williams stood outside the Grand Palmetto Hotel, her suitcase wheels splashing through puddles as she hurried toward the golden glow of the entrance. Her flight had been delayed 3 hours, her connecting flight canceled entirely, and now, at nearly midnight, all she wanted was a hot shower and a soft bed. She had been traveling for 16 hours straight, coming back from a business conference in Seattle. At 67 years old, these cross-country trips were getting harder on her body, but Margaret had never been one to slow down. Her late husband, James, used to joke that she had more energy than women half her age. But tonight, exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy coat. The automatic doors whooshed open, and Margaret stepped into the warm lobby. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft amber glow across marble floors so polished she could see her reflection. The Grand Palmetto was one of Charleston's finest establishments, a historic building that had been carefully restored to its former glory. Margaret had always admired it from the outside during her occasional visits to the city. She approached the front desk, where a young man in his late 20s stood typing on a computer. His name tag read, Trevor, Front Desk Manager. He had slicked back blonde hair and wore the hotel's signature burgundy vest with crisp precision. He didn't look up as she approached. "Good evening," Margaret said, setting her purse on the counter. "I need a room for tonight, please." Trevor's fingers continued dancing across the keyboard for several more seconds before he glanced up. His eyes swept over her quickly, her rain-dampened coat, her sensible traveling shoes, her dark skin, and something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Margaret had lived long enough to recognize that particular look. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying a practiced politeness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're fully booked tonight." Margaret frowned. She pulled out her phone, quickly checking the hotel's website. "Your website shows availability. I can book a room right now online." Trevor's jaw tightened slightly. "Our website isn't always updated in real time. We just filled our last room about 20 minutes ago. You might try the Comfort Inn about 3 miles down Highway 17. They usually have vacancies." Behind Trevor, Margaret noticed another desk clerk, a young woman with auburn hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was watching the exchange with an uncomfortable expression, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "I see," Margaret said slowly. Her heart was beating faster now, a familiar mixture of anger and hurt rising in her chest. How many times in her life had she encountered this? How many closed doors, how many sudden mistakes, how many rooms that were supposedly just taken? She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Could you please check your system again? I really need a room tonight. I've been traveling all day and I'm quite tired." Trevor's expression hardened. "Ma'am, as I said, we're completely full. There's nothing I can do for you." At that moment, a young white couple entered the lobby behind Margaret. laughing and shaking rain from their jackets. They approached the desk, and Margaret stepped aside slightly. "Excuse me," the young man called out cheerfully. "Do you have any rooms available for tonight? We're driving down to Savannah tomorrow, but we're too tired to continue tonight." Margaret watched, her breath caught in her throat, as Trevor's entire demeanor changed. His face broke into a warm smile. "Of course, sir, let me check what we have available for you." His fingers flew across the keyboard with enthusiasm. "We have several options. I can offer you a deluxe queen room on the 4th floor with a view of the historic district, or if you prefer, we have a king suite on the 6th floor. The words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret felt her hands trembling. The young couple seemed oblivious to what had just transpired, happily discussing room options with Trevor. The auburn-haired clerk behind the desk had gone pale. She caught Margaret's eye for just a moment, and Margaret saw recognition there. The woman knew exactly what was happening, and the shame was written clearly across her face. Margaret picked up her purse slowly, deliberately. She didn't say a word. She simply walked away from the desk, her sensible shoes clicking across that beautiful marble floor. But she didn't head for the exit. Instead, she walked toward the elevator bank, standing in the shadows near a large potted palm, her mind racing. She had two choices. She could leave, drive 3 miles in the pouring rain to find another hotel, and add this experience to the long list of indignities she had swallowed over her lifetime. Or she could do something else, something she had never done before. Margaret pulled out her phone and made a call. It rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. "Robert, it's Mom," she said quietly. "I need you to do something for me right now." Her son's voice immediately sharpened with concern. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, honey. But I need you to send me those documents we discussed last month, the ownership papers. Send them to my email right now, please." There was a pause. "The hotel papers? Mom, what's going on?" "Just send them, Robert. I'll explain later." While she waited, Margaret watched the front desk from her position near the elevators. Trevor had completed the check-in for the young couple and was now chatting with another staff member, laughing about something. The auburn-haired clerk had disappeared into a back office. Margaret's phone chimed. She opened her email and downloaded the PDF files Robert had sent. Then she took a moment to compose herself, smoothing down her coat, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. Her reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a dignified woman with silver hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a set to her jaw that James would have recognized immediately. It was the expression she wore when she meant business. She walked back to the front desk. Trevor looked up and surprise flickered across his face, followed quickly by annoyance. "Ma'am, as I told you, we don't have any available rooms." "I'd like to speak with the general manager, please," Margaret interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Trevor's expression shifted to barely concealed irritation. "The general manager isn't on duty at this hour. You'll have to come back during business hours if you want to file a complaint." "Then I'd like to speak with whoever is the senior person on duty tonight." Trevor sighed dramatically. "That would be me, ma'am. As I said, there's nothing I can do for you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual guests to attend to." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, turning the screen toward Trevor. On it was a scanned document, the deed of ownership for the Grand Palmetto Hotel. "Read the name on this document," she said quietly. Trevor's eyes flicked to the screen dismissively, then back to her face. Then they snapped back to the screen, and his expression changed completely. The color drained from his face as his eyes scanned the text. "Williams Family Trust," Margaret said, her voice steady. "Margaret J. Williams, primary trustee." "That's me. This hotel has been in my family for 6 months. We purchased it in April as part of our expansion into historic property restoration. My son runs the business side, but I oversee all our properties personally. I like to visit them unannounced sometimes to see how they're really operating." Trevor's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The auburn-haired clerk had emerged from the back office and stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. "Now," Margaret continued, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you have any rooms available tonight?" The silence in that lobby was deafening. Somewhere in the back, a phone rang unanswered. The sound of rain against the windows seemed suddenly very loud. Trevor's hand shook as he reached for the keyboard. Mrs. Williams, I didn't know. We weren't informed that you would be. Available rooms? Margaret repeated. Do you have any? Yes, ma'am, he whispered. We have several available. How many exactly? Trevor's fingers trembled as he pulled up the system. 14 rooms, ma'am, including 3 suites. Margaret nodded slowly. 14 rooms. And yet, when I asked for one 20 minutes ago, you told me you were completely booked. But when that young white couple asked, suddenly you had several options to offer them. Mrs. Williams, please, I can explain. Don't, Margaret said, holding up her hand. Don't insult me by trying to explain what we both know happened here tonight. She turned to the auburn-haired clerk, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. What's your name? Sarah, ma'am, the young woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, how long have you worked here? 4 months, ma'am. And have you witnessed this kind of thing before? People being turned away while rooms sat empty? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I should have. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Why didn't you? I was afraid of losing my job. Trevor said if I caused trouble, if I questioned his decisions, he'd make sure I was let go. I'm a single mother, Mrs. Williams. I have 2 little boys. I couldn't risk it. Margaret studied the young woman's face and saw genuine remorse there. Then she turned back to Trevor, whose face had gone from white to red. Mrs. Williams, please, Trevor said, desperation creeping into his voice. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't refuse you service. I simply thought. You thought what? Margaret asked. That a black woman walking in alone late at night couldn't possibly afford a room at a nice hotel? That I might cause some kind of trouble? That I didn't belong here? Trevor said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Margaret took a deep breath. Her exhaustion had been replaced by a cold, clear anger, not the hot rage that clouds judgment, but the kind of fury that comes from a lifetime of similar moments, of small cuts that never quite heal. Call your general manager, she said. Right now. I don't care what time it is, tell him to be here in 30 minutes and call your assistant manager, your head of housekeeping, and anyone else on the senior staff. I want them all here, tonight. Mrs. Williams, please. 30 minutes, Margaret repeated. And Trevor? Consider this your last half hour as an employee of this hotel. Trevor's hands shook as he picked up the phone. Margaret watched him make the calls, each conversation more awkward than the last. She could hear the confusion and alarm in the voices on the other end, even from where she stood. Meanwhile, Sarah had quietly offered Margaret a bottle of water and gestured toward the comfortable seating area in the lobby. Would you like to sit down, Mrs. Williams? Sarah asked softly. It might be more comfortable while you wait. Margaret accepted the water with a nod and moved to one of the plush armchairs near the fireplace. From this vantage point, she could see everything. The desk, the entrance, Trevor's increasingly panicked face as he made call after call. She noticed other details, too. The staff photo wall she hadn't seen before, displaying smiling faces of employees. Trevor's photo was prominently placed labeled Employee of the Month, September. Employee of the Month. The irony wasn't lost on her. As she sat there, memories flooded back. She was 7 years old again, standing outside a department store in Birmingham with her mother, watching white families walk through the front entrance while they were directed to the back door. She was 16, being followed around a clothing shop by a suspicious store clerk. She was 23, a young teacher being told an apartment was already rented, only to see it listed in the paper the next day. She was 41, watching her husband James get pulled over for driving suspiciously in their own neighborhood, in the Mercedes he'd worked 2 jobs to afford. Some things had changed in her 67 years, many things. But sitting in this beautiful hotel lobby, being denied a room in a building her own family owned, Margaret realized how much still remained the same. The first to arrive was David Chen, the assistant manager. He was a man in his mid-40s, slightly balding, wearing hastily thrown-on clothes over what was clearly pajamas underneath. His eyes went wide when he saw Margaret sitting by the fireplace, and even wider when Trevor frantically explained the situation in whispered tones. David approached Margaret with genuine distress written across his face. "Mrs. Williams, I am so sorry. I had no idea. If I had been on duty tonight, this never would have happened." Margaret studied him carefully. "How long have you worked here, David?" 14 years, ma'am. I started when I was 30, back when the Hendersons owned the place. I stayed on after your family purchased it. And in those 14 years, have you ever seen Trevor or anyone else turn away guests who had money to pay simply because they didn't like the look of them?" David's face flushed. He glanced back at Trevor, then at the floor. "Mrs. Williams, I don't want to speak out of turn." "This is exactly the turn to speak," Margaret said firmly. "I'm asking you a direct question as the owner of this hotel. Have you witnessed discrimination here?" David took a deep breath. "Not often, ma'am, but yes, a few times over the years, usually late at night when there's less supervision. Trevor has been particularly selective about who he allows to book rooms during his overnight shifts. I've tried to address it, but he's very careful. He always has excuses ready. Computer problems, overbooking errors, payment system issues." "And you never reported this to upper management?" David's shoulders slumped. "I mentioned concerns to the general manager twice. Both times I was told I was being oversensitive, that I was reading too much into normal customer service decisions. The GM at that time, Mr. Patterson, he's retired now. He made it clear that if I kept stirring up trouble, my own position might be at risk. I have a daughter in college, Mrs. Williams. I couldn't afford to lose my job." Margaret nodded slowly. This was the insidious part of it all. Not just the Trevors of the world who actively discriminated, but the systems that protected them, that made good people too afraid to speak up. The next to arrive was Monica Rodriguez, the head of housekeeping. She was a stout woman with kind eyes and gray streaks in her dark hair. She walked in wearing jeans and a windbreaker, clearly having rushed from home. When she saw the scene in the lobby, she seemed to understand immediately. "Oh no," Monica breathed. "Not again." "Again?" Margaret asked sharply. Monica closed her eyes briefly, then walked over to Margaret. "Mrs. Williams, I've been working here for 9 years. I've tried to report problems before. About 6 months ago, just before your family bought the hotel, I went to management about Trevor. A lovely black family checked in one afternoon. They had a reservation, they'd paid in advance online, everything was legitimate. But that night, Trevor called the police on them." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "What?" "He told the police there were suspicious people in the hotel, that he thought they might be using stolen credit cards. The police came, questioned this poor family in the lobby in front of other guests. It was humiliating for them. The family hadn't done anything wrong. Their credit card was perfectly legitimate, their reservation was real. They ended up checking out that night, even though they'd paid for 3 nights. They were too upset to stay." "And what happened to Trevor?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Nothing," Monica said bitterly. "He said he was just being cautious, protecting the hotel. The previous owner brushed it off. Told me I was being emotional." Margaret stood up slowly, her water bottle gripped tightly in her hand. The anger inside her was building, but she kept her voice level. "Why didn't anyone contact my son when we took ownership? Why didn't anyone report this to the new management?" Monica and David exchanged glances. It was Sarah, the auburn-haired clerk, who spoke up from behind the desk. "Because we were told the new owners were keeping all the same policies and management structure," Sarah said quietly. "Trevor told us the Williams family was maintaining the status quo, that nothing would change except the name on the ownership papers. He said the family was hands-off, that they wouldn't be involved in daily operations." Margaret turned to look at Trevor, who had been standing silently near the desk, his face ashen. "Is that what you told the staff?" Trevor said nothing. "Answer me," Margaret commanded. "Did you tell my employees that my family wouldn't be involved in how this hotel was run?" I assumed, Trevor stammered. The general manager said you were just investors, that you wouldn't be. You assumed, Margaret repeated. You assumed that because my family bought this hotel as an investment, we wouldn't care about how it was operated. You assumed we wouldn't care about discrimination happening under our own roof. The lobby doors opened again and a tall, thin man in his late 50s rushed in. He wore an expensive suit, hastily put on, and his gray hair was disheveled. This had to be Marcus Patterson, Jr., the general manager, son of the previous GM David had mentioned. Mrs. Williams, he exclaimed, hurrying over. I am absolutely mortified by what I've been told. Please, let me assure you this is not representative of how we run this establishment. This is clearly an isolated incident. Stop, Margaret said, holding up her hand. Before you say another word, Mr. Patterson, let me ask you something. When my family purchased this hotel 6 months ago, did you do any kind of review of your staff's performance? Any investigation into complaints or concerns? Patterson blinked. Well, we conducted our standard transition procedures. Did you review discrimination complaints? There were no formal complaints filed. Because people were afraid to file them, Margaret interrupted. Because they were told they'd lose their jobs. Because the previous management, your father, dismissed concerns when they were raised. Patterson's face reddened. Mrs. Williams, I understand you're upset, but these are very serious accusations. Accusations? Margaret's voice rose for the first time. Mr. Patterson, I was refused a room in my own hotel tonight because of the color of my skin. That's not an accusation, that's a fact. And from what I'm hearing, it's not the first time something like this has happened here. It's just the first time it happened to someone who owned the building. She turned to address everyone gathered in the lobby: Trevor, Sarah, David, Monica, and Patterson. A night janitor had also appeared from somewhere in the back, watching the scene with wide eyes. I want to tell you all something, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet lobby. My husband James and I built our business from nothing. We started with a small printing shop in Atlanta 40 years ago. We saved every penny. We worked 16-hour days. We faced rejection and discrimination at every turn. Banks wouldn't give us loans. Suppliers wouldn't sell to us. Customers walked out when they saw who owned the business. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But we persisted. We built that printing shop into a successful business. Then we expanded into real estate, then into property management. My son Robert took over the daily operations 5 years ago, and he's grown it even more. We now own 12 properties across the Southeast, including this hotel. Margaret walked slowly toward the desk, her eyes on Trevor. We bought the Grand Palmetto because we believed in preserving historic properties. We believed in creating jobs. We believed in being part of this community. But most of all, we believed that every single person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, or how much money they have in their pocket. She stopped directly in front of Trevor. You didn't just discriminate against a customer tonight. You didn't just violate company policy. You violated everything my family stands for. You took something we built with decades of hard work, with blood and sweat and tears, and you used it to perpetuate the same kind of hatred and bigotry that we spent our lives fighting against. Trevor's eyes were fixed on the floor. Mrs. Williams, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Please, I need this job. I have rent to pay. I have bills. You should have thought about that, Margaret said coldly, before you decided that your prejudices were more important than doing your job with integrity. She turned to Patterson. Mr. Patterson, Trevor is fired, effective immediately. I want him escorted from the building, and I want his access to all systems revoked tonight. Patterson nodded quickly. Of course, Mrs. Williams, absolutely. Furthermore, Margaret continued, I want a complete review of every staff member in this hotel. I want to know who knew about these problems and said nothing. I want to know who participated in discrimination. And I want to know who tried to speak up but was silenced. She looked at David and Monica. I want full written reports from both of you on everything you've witnessed. Names, dates, incidents, everything. Yes, ma'am, they both said. Margaret turned to Sarah, whose eyes were still red from crying. "Sarah, you said you were afraid of losing your job, afraid of not being able to provide for your boys. I understand that fear, but I need to know. Were you ever directly involved in turning people away? Did you ever refuse service to someone because of how they looked?" Sarah shook her head vehemently. "No, ma'am, never, I swear. I only checked people in and out. I processed payments. But I saw things happen, and I didn't speak up, and I'm so ashamed of that." Margaret studied the young woman's face and saw genuine remorse there. "You keep your job, Sarah, but from now on, if you see something wrong, you speak up. You come directly to me if you have to. I'm going to give you my personal phone number, and I want you to call me if anyone retaliates against you for doing the right thing. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah whispered. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Margaret took a deep breath and turned back to Patterson. "As for you, Mr. Patterson, you're on probation. You were responsible for the culture in this hotel and you failed. If my family had known what was happening here, we never would have kept you on as general manager. You have 60 days to prove to me that you can run this hotel the way it should be run, with fairness, with integrity, and with zero tolerance for discrimination. If I hear about one more incident, one more complaint that's dismissed, one more staff member too afraid to speak up, you're done. Are we clear?" Patterson's face had gone pale, but he nodded. "Crystal clear, Mrs. Williams. I promise you things will change. I'll make this right." "See that you do," Margaret said. She glanced at her watch. It was nearly 1:30 in the morning. The exhaustion she'd felt when she first walked in had returned with full force. "Now," she said, "I believe I requested a room. Sarah, would you please check me into your best available suite?" "Right away, Mrs. Williams," Sarah said, her fingers flying across the keyboard with renewed purpose. "I have our presidential suite available on the top floor. It has a beautiful view of the harbor. Complimentary, of course." "I'll pay the full rate," Margaret said firmly. "I don't want special treatment. I just want to be treated like any other guest, with courtesy and respect." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said, processing the transaction properly. As Sarah prepared the keycards, Margaret watched Trevor being escorted out by David. The young man walked past her without raising his eyes, his employee badge already removed from his vest. Part of her felt something, not quite pity but perhaps a sadness for the waste of it all. Trevor was young. He could have learned better, could have grown into someone different. But he had chosen his prejudices over his job, his comfort over doing what was right. Maybe this would be a wake-up call for him. Maybe not. That wasn't Margaret's problem to solve. Margaret rode the elevator to the top floor in silence, her suitcase beside her, Sarah's keycards in her hand. The presidential suite was everything one might expect. Spacious, elegantly furnished, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Charleston's historic waterfront. The harbor lights twinkled in the distance, and she could see the silhouette of Fort Sumter against the night sky. But Margaret barely noticed the view. She set her suitcase down, sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the evening. Her hands were shaking, her heart was racing, and to her surprise, tears began streaming down her face. She cried for the young Margaret who had been turned away from so many places. She cried for James, who had faced 1,000 similar humiliations and never lived to see this moment of vindication. She cried for every person of color who had walked up to a desk, a counter, a door, and been told they didn't belong. And she cried from sheer exhaustion, not just from the long day of travel, but from the exhaustion of having to fight, still, after all these years. After a few minutes, she wiped her eyes, went to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on her face. The woman looking back at her in the mirror was strong, dignified, and tired. So very tired. She picked up her phone and called her son. "Mom?" Robert answered immediately. "What happened? Are you okay?" Margaret told him everything. She spoke for nearly 30 minutes, recounting every detail of the evening. Robert listened in stunned silence, interrupting only occasionally with questions or exclamations of disbelief. "I can't believe this," he said when she finished. "Mom, I'm so sorry." I should have been more involved in the day-to-day operations. I should have visited these properties more often. I trusted Patterson to run things properly, and clearly that was a mistake. It's not your fault, honey, Margaret said softly. We can't be everywhere at once, but this is a wake-up call for both of us. We need better systems in place. We need to know what's really happening in our properties, not just what managers tell us. Agreed, Robert said firmly. First thing Monday morning, I'm implementing new protocols. Anonymous complaint systems, regular staff surveys, unannounced inspections. And Mom, I want you to personally visit every one of our properties over the next few months. Do exactly what you did tonight. Show up unannounced. See how you're treated. If this is happening at the Grand Palmetto, it could be happening elsewhere. Margaret nodded, even though he couldn't see her. That's a good idea. We built this business on principles, Robert. Integrity, fairness, respect. If we're not living up to those values, then what's the point of any of it? Exactly, Robert agreed. Get some rest, Mom. We'll talk more in the morning. I love you. I love you too, son. After hanging up, Margaret took that long-awaited hot shower. She stood under the water for a long time, letting it wash away the stress and anger of the evening. Then she put on her nightgown, set her alarm, and climbed into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept replaying the scene in the lobby, Trevor's dismissive face the moment she revealed who she was. She thought about Sarah, a single mother so afraid of losing her job that she'd stayed silent in the face of injustice. She thought about David and Monica, who had tried to speak up and been shut down. She thought about the Black family who had been humiliated by having police called on them for no reason other than the color of their skin. And she thought about all the people she would never know about. The ones who had been turned away on other nights, who had been made to feel unwelcome, who had driven away into the rain looking for somewhere else to stay, never knowing that the owner of the hotel would have been horrified by how they'd been treated. Finally, sometime around 4 a.m, Margaret drifted off to sleep. She woke at 8 o'clock to bright sunlight streaming through the windows and her phone buzzing with messages. There were texts from Robert, from her daughter Linda in Atlanta, from her sister Joyce. Robert had apparently told the family what happened, and everyone was checking on her. She responded to each message assuring them she was fine, then ordered room service for breakfast. While she waited for her food to arrive, she opened her laptop and began drafting an email. New policies for all Williams family trust properties, based on what she'd learned last night. The breakfast arrived, brought by a young man named Marcus, who was professional, friendly, and gave no indication of knowing who she was. Margaret tipped him generously and enjoyed her coffee and eggs while watching the morning sun sparkle on the harbor water. At 10 o'clock, she dressed in one of her business suits, a tailored Navy outfit that James had always said made her look like she owned the place, which, she reflected with a slight smile, she did. She took the elevator down to the lobby. The morning shift was in full swing now. A different clerk was at the front desk, an older woman with gray hair and a warm smile. Guests moved through the lobby with luggage, checking out or heading to breakfast. Everything looked normal, professional, welcoming, but Margaret knew that appearances could be deceiving. She approached the front desk. The older clerk looked up with a genuine smile. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" "Good morning," Margaret said. "My name is Margaret Williams. I'm the owner of this hotel. Is Mr. Patterson available?" The clerk's eyes widened slightly, but her professionalism held. "Yes, Mrs. Williams. Let me call him right away." Within minutes, Patterson appeared from his office looking considerably more composed than he had at 1:30 in the morning. He was freshly shaved, wearing a crisp suit, and had clearly prepared himself for this encounter. "Mrs. Williams," he said, extending his hand. "I hope you slept well. I want to apologize again for last night's incident. I've already begun implementing changes." Margaret shook his hand and gestured toward his office. "Let's talk." They sat in Patterson's office, a well-appointed room with photos of the hotel throughout its history covering the walls. Margaret noticed that Patterson looked nervous, his hands clasped tightly on his desk. "Tell me about these changes," Margaret said. Patterson pulled out a notebook, flipping it open to reveal several pages of handwritten notes. First, I've scheduled mandatory training for all staff, customer service, sensitivity training, and clear protocols for non-discrimination. I've contacted 3 different training companies this morning to get quotes. Good, Margaret said. Continue. Second, I've drafted a new employee handbook section specifically addressing discrimination and providing clear channels for reporting concerns. Employees can report directly to me, to HR, or anonymously through a new hotline I'm setting up. Better, Margaret acknowledged. What else? I'm implementing a review process for any situation where we turn away potential guests. If someone is denied a room, the staff member must document the reason, and I will personally review each instance. No more judgment calls made in the moment without accountability. Margaret nodded slowly. These are good steps, Mr. Patterson. But I want to be clear about something. Changes to policy and procedure are important, but they're not enough. The real issue is culture. The real issue is that people like Trevor felt comfortable being discriminatory because they thought no one would care or no one would stop them. I understand, Patterson said quietly. And Mrs. Williams, I need to be honest with you. My father ran this hotel for 30 years before I took over. He was old school. He didn't believe in what he called coddling staff or guests. He thought people were too sensitive, that they saw discrimination where there was just common sense business decisions. I was raised with those attitudes, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't question them as much as I should have. Margaret studied his face. Go on. When David and Monica came to me with concerns, I dismissed them. Not because I'm actively racist, I don't think of myself that way, but because I'd been taught that making a big deal out of these things was worse than the things themselves. I was taught to protect the business first, to avoid controversy, to back up my staff even when they were wrong. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Last night, seeing you turned away, hearing the pain in your voice, it made me realize how wrong I've been, how much harm I've allowed through my inaction. Mr. Patterson, Margaret said carefully, I appreciate your honesty. I do. But you need to understand that good intentions and belated realizations aren't enough. The damage has been done. Trust has been broken, not just with me, but with your staff, with guests who were mistreated, with this entire community. I know, Patterson said. What can I do to make it right? Margaret leaned forward. You can start by understanding that this isn't just about fixing problems at this hotel. This is about being part of a larger solution. I want you to reach out to civil rights organizations in Charleston. I want you to partner with them. Bring them in to help with training. Ask them to help you understand the history of discrimination in this city, in this very building. She gestured to the historic photos on the wall. Do you know the history of this hotel, Mr. Patterson? I did some research before we purchased it. The Grand Palmetto was built in 1928. It was a whites-only establishment until 1968, 40 years where black people couldn't stay here, couldn't eat in the restaurant, couldn't even enter through the front door unless they were working here. When integration finally happened, it was fought tooth and nail by the ownership at the time. Patterson looked at the photos with new eyes, his face troubled. History matters, Margaret continued. The attitudes that created segregation didn't disappear overnight. They evolved, became more subtle, hid behind excuses and business decisions. What Trevor did to me last night is connected to that history. And if you're going to run this hotel with integrity, you need to understand that connection. I will, Patterson said earnestly. Mrs. Williams, I give you my word. I'll do everything you've suggested and more. I'll make this hotel a place where everyone is truly welcome. Margaret stood up. I'm going to hold you to that, Mr. Patterson. And I'll be back, maybe in a month, maybe in 3 months, unannounced. And if I find that things haven't changed, if I find that the same problems are still happening, then our conversation will be very different. Understood, Patterson said, standing as well. Thank you for giving me this chance. As Margaret left his office, she noticed several staff members watching from various positions around the lobby. Word had clearly spread about what happened last night. She could see curiosity in their faces, some nervousness, some hope. She walked over to where Monica was supervising a housekeeping cart, speaking in Spanish to two younger staff members. "Mrs. Williams," Monica said, straightening up. "Good morning." "Good morning, Monica," Margaret said warmly. "I wanted to thank you for speaking honestly last night. It took courage." Monica's eyes glistened. "Thank you for listening, and thank you for doing something about it. I've worked in hotels for 23 years, and this is the first time I've seen an owner actually care about what happens to people like me. People like you are the backbone of this business," Margaret said firmly. "Without dedicated staff like you, none of this works. Your voice matters, Monica, don't ever forget that." She spent the next hour walking through the hotel, talking to staff members, asking questions, listening to their stories. She met Carlos, a maintenance worker who had been with the hotel for 15 years. She met Jennifer, a young woman who worked in the restaurant and was putting herself through college. She met Robert, not her son, but a different Robert, who worked as a porter and had dreams of becoming a manager someday. Each person had a story. Each person had experienced or witnessed something troubling at one time or another. But each person also expressed hope that things might finally change. By noon, Margaret was ready to check out. She had a flight back to Atlanta that evening, but she wanted to spend the afternoon walking around Charleston, visiting the historic sites, maybe having lunch at one of the restaurants near the waterfront. At the front desk, the older clerk from that morning handled her checkout with perfect professionalism. Her name tag read, Dorothy. "I hope everything was satisfactory, Mrs. Williams," Dorothy said with a genuine smile. "Dorothy," Margaret said, "how long have you worked here?" 22 years, ma'am. I started as a housekeeper, worked my way up to front desk supervisor." 22 years, Margaret repeated. "Have you seen things change in that time?" Dorothy's smile faded slightly. She glanced around, then leaned in closer. "Mrs. Williams, I've seen a lot. Some good, some not so good. Last night, what happened to you? I heard about it this morning and I cried. Because I've seen it happen before and I've felt powerless to stop it." "You're not powerless," Margaret said gently. "Not anymore. If you see something wrong, I want you to speak up. Here's my personal card. My cell phone number is on it. You call me directly if you need to." Dorothy took the card with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Thank you so much." As Margaret walked out of the Grand Palmetto Hotel that sunny October morning, she felt different than when she'd arrived in the rain the night before. She felt tired still, yes. She felt sad about the state of the world, about how much work there was still to do. But she also felt something else, a sense of purpose, a renewed determination. She and James had built their business to create opportunities, to build something lasting, to leave the world a little better than they'd found it. Last night had been a stark reminder of how easily those values could be undermined if she and Robert weren't vigilant. But it had also shown her that she had the power to make real change. Not by being silent, not by accepting discrimination, but by standing firm in her principles and demanding better. As she walked along the Charleston waterfront, enjoying the salt breeze and the sight of sailboats on the harbor, her phone rang. It was Robert. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about visiting our other properties unannounced." "Yes? I want to do it with you. I want us to visit them together. I need to see firsthand what's happening, just like you did. When can we start?" Margaret smiled. "How about next week? We have that property in Savannah." "Perfect," Robert said. "Mom, I'm proud of you. Dad would be proud too." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different tears, not tears of pain or frustration, but tears of hope and determination. "Thank you, honey. I think you're right. I think your father would be proud, not just of what we've built, but of what we're willing to do to protect it." After hanging up, Margaret found a small cafe and ordered lunch. She sat outside watching people pass by, families, couples, groups of friends, all different colors and backgrounds, all sharing the same beautiful autumn day. This was what she was fighting for. Not just for herself, not just for her family's business, but for the simple right of everyone to move through the world with dignity, to be judged by their character and their actions rather than the color of their skin, The Grand Palmetto was just one hotel. Trevor was just one person. But the ripples from last night would spread outward, creating change not just in that building, but hopefully in the hearts and minds of everyone who heard the story. Margaret finished her lunch, left a generous tip, and headed back to her rental car. She had a few more hours before her flight, and she wanted to visit the Mother Emanuel AME Church to pay her respects and to reflect on the long journey toward justice that so many had walked before her. As she drove through Charleston's historic streets, past old plantations and monuments, past neighborhoods that still bore the scars of segregation and the signs of ongoing gentrification, Margaret thought about the complexity of it all. Progress wasn't a straight line. It was messy, difficult, full of setbacks and small victories. But last night had been a victory, however painful it had been to achieve. And she would take that victory, learn from it, and use it to fuel the work still ahead. Because that's what James would have done. And that's what she would continue to do for as long as she had breath in her body and fire in her heart. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in the conference room of the Williams Family Trust headquarters in Atlanta, looking at a screen displaying survey results from the Grand Palmetto Hotel. Robert sat beside her along with their HR director, Carmen Hughes, and their new director of operations, a sharp woman named Diane Foster, whom they'd brought on specifically to oversee the implementation of their new policies. "The numbers are encouraging," Carmen said, clicking through the slides. "Staff satisfaction has increased by 32% since the new policies were implemented. More importantly, staff now report feeling comfortable bringing up concerns. That metric went from 18% to 71%. "What about guest feedback?" Margaret asked. Diane pulled up another chart. "Guest satisfaction scores have actually improved as well. We're seeing more positive reviews mentioning staff friendliness and professionalism. It seems that when employees feel respected and empowered, they provide better service." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Patterson sent me his report this morning. He's partnered with 3 local organizations, the NAACP Charleston branch, the Lowcountry Civil Rights Museum, and a diversity training group called Bridges Forward. They've conducted 2 full-day training sessions with the entire staff, and feedback has been overwhelmingly positive." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. "That's good. But numbers and training sessions aren't the whole story. How do we know what's really happening day to day?" "That's why we're implementing the Mystery Guest Program," Diane said. "Starting next month, we'll have volunteers from civil rights organizations visit all our properties unannounced, posing as regular guests. They'll document their experiences, both good and bad, and report directly to us." "I like that," Margaret said, "but I also want to keep doing my own visits. Robert and I have been talking about making this a regular part of our oversight." Carmen smiled. "I think that's an excellent idea. There's no substitute for seeing things firsthand." The meeting continued for another hour, reviewing similar data from their other properties. So far, they hadn't uncovered situations as egregious as what happened at the Grand Palmetto, but they'd found plenty of room for improvement. Inconsistent policies, inadequate training, staff members who felt their concerns were dismissed. After the meeting ended and the others had left, Robert stayed behind with his mother. "Mom, I've been thinking," he said. "What happened to you at the Grand Palmetto? It's a powerful story. Have you thought about sharing it more widely?" Margaret looked at him skeptically. "What do you mean?" "I mean going public, talking to the media, maybe writing an article. This isn't just about our business. It's about something bigger. How many other Black business owners face discrimination at their own properties and never speak up? How many people experience what you experienced and have no recourse because they don't happen to own the building?" Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. "I don't know, Robert. Part of me feels like we handled it internally, made the changes we needed to make. Do we really need to make this public?" "I think we do," Robert said gently. "Not for attention, not for publicity, but because silence perpetuates the problem. People need to know these things still happen. Business owners need to understand that policies and procedures mean nothing if the culture is rotten, and workers need to know they have the right to speak up without fear." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Finally, She turned back to her son. Let me think about it. Over the next week, Margaret did think about it. She thought about it while reviewing reports at her desk. She thought about it while having lunch with her daughter Linda, who had strong opinions about going public. Mom, you have to tell your story. This is important. She thought about it while visiting her church, where the pastor's sermon about standing up for justice seemed to speak directly to her situation. And she thought about it late at night, when she couldn't sleep, when the memories of that rainy evening in Charleston came flooding back with painful clarity. Finally, she called Robert. Okay, she said. Let's do it. But I want to tell the story my way with dignity, focusing on the lessons learned and the changes we're making. Absolutely, Robert agreed. I'll reach out to some journalists I trust. 2 weeks later, Margaret sat across from Jasmine Carter, a reporter for a major national newspaper who had covered civil rights issues for over a decade. They met in a quiet corner of a coffee shop in Atlanta, away from the bustle of the main area. Jasmine was a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a warm demeanor that put Margaret at ease. She explained that she wanted to write a feature story about Margaret's experience, but also about the broader issues of discrimination in business and the work being done to address it. Mrs. Williams, Jasmine said, her recorder running on the table between them. Tell me what happened that night in Charleston. Margaret took a deep breath and began to tell the story. She talked about the long day of travel, the exhaustion, the hope of finally getting a room for the night. She described Trevor's dismissive attitude, the moment when he told her there were no rooms available, and then the sudden availability when the white couple walked in. She talked about the decision to reveal who she was, the confrontation in the lobby, the firing of Trevor, and the conversations with other staff members who had witnessed discrimination but felt powerless to stop it. Jasmine listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Margaret finished the immediate story, Jasmine leaned forward. How did you feel in that moment when Trevor first turned you away? Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Tired, so tired. Not just physically, but tired of having to face this kind of thing. I'm 67 years old. I've been dealing with discrimination my entire life. You'd think by now, with everything I've accomplished, with everything my generation fought for, things would be different. But standing at that desk, being looked at like I didn't belong, I felt like that 7-year-old girl in Birmingham again, being told to use the back door. And when you revealed you owned the hotel? Powerful, Margaret admitted. I won't lie. There was satisfaction in seeing the shock on Trevor's face. But it was also heartbreaking, because I realized that if I hadn't owned that hotel, if I'd just been a regular customer, nothing would have happened to him. He would have kept his job. He would have kept discriminating, and the system would have protected him. Jasmine nodded thoughtfully. Tell me about the changes you've implemented since then. Margaret outlined all the new policies, the training programs, the anonymous reporting systems, the partnerships with civil rights organizations. She talked about the mystery guest program and her commitment to personally visiting properties unannounced. But here's what I want people to understand, Margaret said passionately. These policies and programs are important, but they're not enough. The real change has to happen in hearts and minds. We have to create a culture where discrimination isn't just against the rules, it's unthinkable. Where staff members don't stay silent because they're afraid, but speak up because they know it's right and they'll be supported. How do you do that? Jasmine asked. By being intentional about it every single day, Margaret said. By hiring diverse staff. By promoting people based on merit and character. By listening to concerns and taking them seriously. By showing through our actions, not just our words, that we mean what we say about respect and dignity for all people. She paused, gathering her thoughts. My husband James used to say that discrimination thrives in darkness. When people can hide their prejudices behind closed doors and whispered conversations, when they can make judgment calls that are never questioned, that's when it flourishes. But when you shine a light on it, when you make it visible and hold people accountable, that's when change becomes possible. Do you think Trevor learned anything from being fired? Jasmine asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. I honestly don't know. I hope so. I hope he took time to reflect on his actions and his attitudes. I hope he understands now that his prejudices cost him his job and his reputation. But I also know that real change is hard. It's easier to make excuses, to blame others, to insist you're not really racist even when your actions say otherwise. Have you heard from him at all? No, Margaret said, and I don't expect to. But you know what I have heard? I've heard from dozens of people who've experienced similar situations. People who read about what happened, it spread on social media before we even went to the press, and reached out to share their stories. Black professionals who've been followed in stores, questioned about their credit cards, assumed to be in the wrong place. It's a reminder of how pervasive this issue still is. Jasmine made some notes, then looked up. What do you say to people who argue that we're in a post-racial society, that these incidents are rare exceptions? Margaret's laugh was bitter. I'd invite them to spend a day walking in my shoes. Or better yet, in the shoes of a young black man who gets pulled over for driving suspiciously in his own neighborhood. Or a black family that gets police called on them while having a barbecue in a public park. Or a black professional who's constantly asked to prove their credentials because people assume they're not qualified. She leaned forward, her voice intense. These aren't rare exceptions. They're daily realities for millions of people. The difference is that most people who experience discrimination don't own the building where it happens. They don't have the power to fire the person who mistreated them. They just have to swallow their anger, maintain their dignity, and keep moving forward. And that's why you decided to go public with your story? Yes, Margaret said firmly. Because I have a platform that others don't have. Because staying silent feels like a betrayal of all the people who don't have a voice. And because if my story can help even one business owner examine their own practices, or encourage one employee to speak up about discrimination, or give one person who's been mistreated the courage to file a complaint, then it's worth the discomfort of sharing it. The interview continued for another hour. Jasmine asked about Margaret's background, her journey from a printing shop in Atlanta to owning multiple properties across the Southeast. She asked about James and how his death had affected Margaret's approach to business. She asked about Robert and Linda and the next generation of the Williams family. Finally, as they were wrapping up, Jasmine asked one more question. What do you want people to take away from your story? Margaret thought for a moment. I want them to understand that discrimination isn't always loud and obvious. It's not always people using racial slurs or burning crosses. Often, it's quiet and subtle. It's a desk clerk finding excuses to deny service. It's a manager who dismisses valid concerns. It's a system that protects the wrong people and silences the right ones. She continued, but I also want people to know that change is possible. It requires courage. The courage to speak up, to challenge the status quo, to hold people accountable. It requires commitment, not just making policies, but actually enforcing them and creating a culture of respect. And it requires vigilance, constantly checking to make sure your values are being lived out in practice, not just written in a handbook. And on a personal level? Jasmine prompted. On a personal level, I want people to know that you're never too old to stand up for what's right. I'm 67 years old. I could have just accepted what happened, checked into another hotel, and moved on with my life. Many people would have. But I chose to speak up, to demand better, to use my position to create change. And if I can do that at my age after all I've been through, then anyone can. The article was published 3 weeks later. It appeared on the front page of the newspaper's Sunday edition, accompanied by a photo of Margaret standing in front of the Williams Family Trust headquarters. The headline read, When a hotel owner was denied a room at her own property, a story about race, business, and the power of speaking up. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Margaret's phone rang constantly with interview requests from other media outlets. The story was shared thousands of times on social media. People from across the country sent emails and letters, sharing their own experiences with discrimination and thanking Margaret for speaking out. But there was also backlash. Some people accused her of playing the race card. Others claimed she had made the whole thing up for publicity. A few suggested that Trevor had been unfairly treated, that he'd made an honest mistake and didn't deserve to lose his job. Margaret read every comment, every letter, every email, both positive and negative. The negative ones stung, but they also reinforced why she'd been right to speak out. The fact that some people refused to believe her story or defended Trevor's actions showed how much work still needed to be done. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was from Trevor himself. The letter was short, handwritten on plain white paper. It read, "Mrs. Williams, I don't expect you to respond to this letter, and I'm not writing to ask for my job back. I'm writing because I need to say something that I should have said that night in Charleston. I'm sorry. You were right about me. I did make assumptions based on how you looked. I convinced myself that I was just being cautious, protecting the hotel, making good business decisions. But the truth is, I was being prejudiced. I treated you with disrespect because of the color of your skin, and there's no excuse for that. Losing my job was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to look at myself honestly for the first time. I've spent these past months thinking about my attitudes, my actions, the way I was raised, and the beliefs I never questioned. I've started volunteering at a community center in North Charleston, working with kids from all backgrounds. I'm taking classes on African American history and civil rights. I'm trying to be a better person than the one who stood behind that desk and treated you so poorly. I don't know if I'll ever fully overcome my prejudices, but I'm trying. And I wanted you to know that your actions that night, standing up for yourself, refusing to accept being treated that way, it changed my life. It forced me to change. Thank you for that, and again, I'm truly sorry, Trevor." Margaret read the letter 3 times. She felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at what had happened, skepticism about whether Trevor's change was real, but also a small measure of hope that maybe, just maybe, good could come from even the most painful experiences. She showed the letter to Robert and Linda over dinner that evening. They discussed it at length, debating whether Trevor's apology was genuine or whether he was just trying to rehabilitate his image. "I think the fact that he didn't ask for anything tells me something," Linda said. "He's not asking for his job back. He's not asking for forgiveness. He's just acknowledging what he did and telling you he's trying to change." "People can change," Robert added. "Not everyone does, but some people can when they're confronted with the consequences of their actions." Margaret folded the letter carefully. "I'm not going to respond to this, but I'm going to keep it. As a reminder that speaking up matters, that consequences matter, that even when it's uncomfortable and difficult and people criticize you for it, standing firm in your principles can make a difference." 6 months after that rainy night in Charleston, Margaret found herself back at the Grand Palmetto Hotel. This time her visit was announced. This time, she walked through the front doors, not as a weary traveler, but as the guest of honor at a special event. The lobby had been transformed for the occasion. A small stage had been set up near the fireplace, decorated with flowers and the Williams Family Trust logo. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, and the room was filled with people, hotel staff, local business owners, representatives from civil rights organizations, and members of the press. Margaret wore her finest dress, a deep purple outfit that Linda had helped her pick out. Robert stood beside her, looking proud in his dark suit. Patterson was there too, looking nervous but hopeful. The event had been Robert's idea. After the success of the policy changes at the Grand Palmetto and the positive media coverage of Margaret's story, he'd suggested doing something more, creating an award program to recognize hospitality workers who demonstrated exceptional commitment to dignity, respect, and standing up against discrimination. They were calling it the James Williams Award for Excellence in Hospitality, named after Margaret's late husband. The first recipient would be announced today, here at the Grand Palmetto, at the very site where Margaret's experience had sparked this journey of change. As Margaret took her seat in the front row, she looked around at the assembled crowd. She saw Dorothy, the front desk clerk who had worked there for 22 years. She saw Monica, the head of housekeeping who had been brave enough to share what she'd witnessed. She saw David, the assistant manager who had tried to speak up and been shut down. and she saw Sarah, the young single mother who had been too afraid to challenge Trevor, but had shown genuine remorse. There were also faces she didn't recognize, new hires who had come on board since the policy changes, attracted by the hotel's new reputation as a place that valued diversity and respect. Patterson approached the microphone on the stage, tapping it gently to test the sound. The room quieted. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "Thank you all for being here today. 6 months ago, something happened in this lobby that changed everything for this hotel, for our company, and frankly, for me personally." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. 6 months ago, our owner, Mrs. Margaret Williams, was denied a room at her own hotel because of the color of her skin. As the general manager, the person responsible for the culture and operations of this establishment, that failure falls on my shoulders. The room was completely silent. Margaret could hear the slight tremor in Patterson's voice as he continued. "I could stand here and make excuses. I could say I didn't know what was happening on the night shift. I could say it was just one bad employee. But that would be dishonest. The truth is, I had been told about problems, I had been given warnings, and I chose to ignore them because it was easier than confronting difficult truths about my own biases and the culture I had allowed to develop." He looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Williams, I can never fully apologize for what you experienced that night. But I can promise you, and everyone here, that it will never happen again. Not on my watch. Not in this hotel. Not if I have anything to say about it." There was a smattering of applause. Patterson stepped back and Robert came forward to take his place at the microphone. "Thank you, Marcus," Robert said. "What happened to my mother that night was painful and infuriating, but it also became a catalyst for change, not just at the Grand Palmetto, but across all of our properties and, we hope, throughout the hospitality industry." He gestured to a display board that had been set up showing statistics and charts. "In the 6 months since we implemented our new policies, we've seen remarkable improvements. Employee satisfaction is at an all-time high. Guest satisfaction has increased by 23%. Staff turnover has decreased by 40%. And most importantly, we've received 0 complaints about discrimination." Robert smiled. But numbers only tell part of the story. The real story is in the people, the employees who now feel empowered to speak up, the guests who feel genuinely welcomed, the culture of respect and dignity that's being built, one interaction at a time. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "My father, James Williams, built our family business on a simple principle. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Respect everyone, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Value character over appearance, integrity over convenience." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of James. Robert caught her eye and smiled gently before continuing. "My father faced discrimination throughout his life. He was denied loans, turned away from businesses, questioned and doubted at every turn. But he never let that make him bitter. Instead, he used it as motivation to build something better, a business that would create opportunities for everyone, that would stand as an example of what's possible when you lead with integrity." Robert gestured toward his mother. "And my mother has carried on that legacy with grace, strength, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." He turned back to the audience. "That's why we created the James Williams Award for Excellence in Hospitality. This award isn't just about being good at your job. It's about having the courage to stand up for what's right. It's about creating a culture of respect and dignity. It's about being the kind of person who makes the hospitality industry better just by being in it." Robert picked up an envelope from the podium. This year's recipient demonstrated exceptional courage in the face of difficulty. This person witnessed injustice and, despite personal risk, chose to speak the truth. This person has worked tirelessly to make the Grand Palmetto a place where everyone truly feels welcome. This person embodies the values my father held dear, and that our family continues to champion." He opened the envelope slowly. "The first recipient of the James Williams Award for Excellence in Hospitality is Sarah Mitchell." There was a gasp from somewhere in the crowd, and then enthusiastic applause. "Sarah, The auburn-haired desk clerk who had stood silently behind Trevor that night sat frozen in her seat, her hand over her mouth in shock. Margaret turned in her seat to look at Sarah, smiling and gesturing for her to come forward. Sarah stood on shaking legs and made her way to the stage, tears streaming down her face. Robert handed her a beautiful crystal plaque and shook her hand. Then he stepped back, allowing Sarah to approach the microphone. I don't know what to say, Sarah stammered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't deserve this. That night I didn't speak up. I didn't defend Mrs. Williams. I just stood there, afraid and silent. But that's not the end of your story, Robert said gently, stepping back to the microphone. Tell them what you did after that night. Sarah wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. After Mrs. Williams left that night, after Trevor was fired, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my two boys, about what kind of example I was setting for them, about what I would want them to do if they saw something wrong. She looked out at the audience. The next day, I went to Mr. Patterson's office. I told him everything I had witnessed over the 4 months I'd worked here. I gave him names, dates, specific incidents. I knew I might lose my job, but I decided I'd rather lose my job than lose my integrity. Sarah turned to Margaret. Mrs. Williams, I can never apologize enough for not speaking up that night, but I promise you I will never be silent again. Since that night, I've spoken up 3 times when I saw guests being treated unfairly. I've helped train new staff on our anti-discrimination policies. And I've tried every single day to honor the second chance you gave me. The applause was thunderous. Margaret stood and walked to the stage, embracing Sarah warmly. When the applause finally died down, Margaret took the microphone. Sarah, Margaret said softly, you did more than you realized that night. Your face, your expression, I could see your distress, your discomfort with what was happening. That told me I wasn't imagining things. That told me I was right to be upset. And your willingness to speak up afterward, to risk your job to tell the truth, that's real courage. She turned to address the full audience. This award isn't about being perfect. None of us are perfect. We all have moments when fear keeps us silent, when we choose the easy path over the right path. What matters is what we do next. Do we make excuses and move on? Or do we learn from our mistakes and commit to doing better? Margaret's voice strengthened. My husband James used to say that character isn't what you do when everyone is watching. It's what you do when you think no one will notice. It's the small choices, the daily decisions to be kind, to be fair, to stand up for what's right even when it costs you something. She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. Every person in this room has power. Maybe you don't own the building. Maybe you're not the manager or the boss. But you have the power to speak up. You have the power to treat people with respect. You have the power to make someone's day better or worse by how you interact with them. That night 6 months ago, Margaret continued, I was exhausted, frustrated, and hurt. I could have just left. Many people would have, but I stayed because I knew that if I didn't speak up, nothing would change. If I accepted that treatment silently, I would be giving permission for it to continue. She paused, letting her words sink in. And I want everyone here to know, whether you're a housekeeper or a manager, whether you've been here 20 years or 20 days, if you see something wrong, you speak up. You come to me, you come to Robert, you come to your manager, you use our anonymous hotline. We will listen. We will investigate and we will take action. Margaret's expression softened. But this isn't just about catching bad behavior. It's about celebrating good behavior. It's about recognizing people like Sarah who find their courage and use it to make things better. It's about building a culture where respect and dignity aren't just words in a handbook. They're lived reality every single day. She smiled at the audience. That's why we're here today. That's why we created this award. Because we want to honor the Sarah Mitchells of the world. The people who stumble, who make mistakes, but who get back up and commit to doing better. Those are the people who will change our industry, our businesses, our world. The applause was long and warm. As it finally subsided, Patterson returned to the microphone. We have one more announcement to make today, he said. Mrs. Williams and the Williams Family Trust have established a scholarship fund in partnership with the Low Country Civil Rights Museum. This fund will provide college scholarships to children of hospitality workers, with special consideration given to those who demonstrate commitment to civil rights and social justice. He smiled. The first recipient of this scholarship is Sarah Mitchell's son, Marcus Mitchell, who has expressed interest in studying law with a focus on civil rights. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth again, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Margaret walked over and hugged her tightly as the room erupted in applause once more. After the formal ceremony ended, a reception was held in the hotel's restaurant. Margaret moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and thanks, but also listening to stories. A young black man told her about being stopped by police while delivering room service in another hotel, suspicion that he was somewhere he shouldn't be. An older woman shared her experience of being charged more for a room than the quoted price, only to have the mistake corrected when she threatened to report them. A Latino housekeeper spoke about years of being invisible, treated as less than human by guests and managers alike. Each story was a reminder of why this work mattered. Each story reinforced Margaret's commitment to continue pushing for change. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself standing by the window overlooking the harbor, the same view she'd had from the presidential suite that difficult night 6 months ago. The water sparkled in the afternoon sun, and she could see tourists walking along the waterfront, enjoying the beautiful spring day. Monica approached with a cup of tea for Margaret. "Mrs. Williams, I wanted to thank you again, not just for today, but for everything you've done." "You don't need to thank me, Monica," Margaret said warmly. "You were the one who had the courage to tell me the truth that night." "Maybe," Monica said. "But you were the one who listened. You were the one who did something about it. Do you know how many times I've told managers about problems only to be ignored or told I was overreacting? You were different. You cared." Margaret squeezed Monica's hand. "I cared because I've lived it. Because I know what it's like to be dismissed, to be treated as less than. And because I have the power to make changes, and with power comes responsibility." Dorothy, the longtime desk clerk, joined them. "Mrs. Williams, I've been wanting to tell you something. Yesterday, a young black couple checked in. They were nervous, kept checking their confirmation email, like they expected something to go wrong. When I processed their check-in smoothly and welcomed them warmly, the woman started crying. She told me she'd been refused rooms at 2 other hotels that weekend, given excuses about overbooking and system errors. She said checking into our hotel and being treated with respect and dignity was the highlight of her trip. Margaret felt her own eyes well up. "That's exactly why we do this work, Dorothy. So that everyone can walk through those doors and feel welcome, feel respected, feel like they belong." As the sun began to set over Charleston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the guests began to depart. Sarah left with her 2 boys, clutching her award like it was made of pure gold. Monica and Dorothy hugged Margaret goodbye, promising to keep in touch. Patterson shook hands with Robert, discussing plans for continued improvements and upcoming training sessions. Finally, it was just Margaret and Robert standing in the lobby, the same lobby where 6 months earlier, everything had changed. "Dad would be proud of you, Mom," Robert said softly, putting his arm around her shoulders. Margaret leaned against her son, feeling the weight of exhaustion, but also the lightness of accomplishment. "I hope so, honey. I hope so." "I know so," Robert insisted. "You took something painful and turned it into something meaningful. You didn't just get angry, though you had every right to be angry. You created change, real lasting change." Margaret looked around the lobby, at the diverse staff photos on the wall now, at the new "All are welcome here" placard, prominently displayed near the entrance at the suggestion box that had been installed for anonymous feedback. "It's just one hotel," Margaret said. "One hotel, in one city. There's still so much work to do." "But it's a start," Robert replied. "And every journey begins with a single step, right? You took that step. You refused to be silent. And look at the ripples spreading out from that one moment of courage." Margaret thought about Sarah, finding her voice and her courage. She thought about Patterson, confronting his own biases and committing to change. She thought about the young black couple who had cried tears of relief at being treated with simple human dignity. She thought about Trevor's letter and his journey toward becoming a better person. And she thought about all the people she would never meet, who would benefit from these changes, the travelers who would check into the Grand Palmetto and be welcomed regardless of their race, the employees who would feel empowered to speak up, the children who would grow up in a slightly more just world because of the work being done today. "You're right," Margaret said finally. "It is just a start. But it's an important start." She pulled out her phone and looked at her calendar. Next week, she and Robert were scheduled to make an unannounced visit to their property in Savannah. The week after, they'd visit the one in Birmingham, the city where Margaret had grown up, where she'd first experienced the sting of discrimination as a young girl. "Shall we make reservations for Savannah?" Robert asked, reading her thoughts. Margaret smiled. "No reservations. Let's just show up and see what happens. That's when you learn the truth. And if something's wrong, then we fix it," Margaret said firmly. "Just like we did here. We shine a light on it, we hold people accountable, and we make it right." As they walked out of the Grand Palmetto Hotel that evening, Margaret paused at the entrance and looked back one more time. This building, with its beautiful architecture and painful history, was now part of her legacy. Not just as a property she owned, but as a place where change had begun, where one woman's refusal to accept discrimination had sparked a movement toward something better. She thought about the long road that had brought her here, from that 7-year-old girl at the back door in Birmingham, to the young bride building a business with James, to the widow at 67 still fighting for dignity and respect. It had been a hard road, full of obstacles and heartbreak. But it had also been a road worth traveling, because change was possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. And it started with people who refused to accept the status quo, who demanded better, who stood up and said no more. Margaret took Robert's arm, and together they walked out into the warm Charleston evening. The city lights were coming on, twinkling in the dusk. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. And in the harbor, ships moved slowly through the water, their lights reflecting on the gentle waves. 6 months ago, Margaret had arrived at this hotel in the rain, tired and seeking rest. Tonight she left in the sunset, still tired but also energized by hope and purpose. The work wasn't finished. It would never truly be finished. But progress had been made. Lives had been changed. And the ripples would continue spreading outward, touching people she would never meet, creating a more just world, one interaction at a time. And that, Margaret thought, as she and Robert drove away from the Grand Palmetto Hotel, that was worth everything. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Discrimination still exists in our world, but change is possible when we have the courage to speak up. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Remember, you're never too old, and it's never too late to make a difference. Be like Margaret. Speak up. Stand firm. Change the world. Thank you for listening.